So ex-Impaulsive host George Janko just scored his biggest podcast ever with the Top G as his guest. For those of you who don't know, George Janko was a host of Logan Paul's podcast Impaulsive, but he left earlier this year and decided to start his own show. Following several controversies and heated moments on the Logan Paul podcast, Janko would finally leave the show earlier this year and start his own podcast. On December 4th, Janko announced on Twitter that he had flown to Romania and he had an exclusive interview with the Top G and his brother Tristan. Quote, "This week's episode with Top G is gonna be wild," he wrote in a tweet. This interview was extremely hyped up, with several commenters saying things like, "This is huge." Now, although George Janko is not necessarily many Impaulsive fans' favorite personality, this didn't stop the interview from gaining massive attention. The podcast currently sits at over 6 million views in under a week, which is extremely impressive considering Janko's typical numbers. However, being such a controversial interview, there are a few highlights we should talk about, such as how this clip was taken down by Instagram in a move that Janko would refer to as censorship. Quote, "Instagram just took down this post for no reason? What are we censoring?" Now, considering every major social media platform has banned the Top G for several reasons, this isn't really surprising. Now, this podcast is definitely one that has caused many people to get upset, both because the Top G is one of the most controversial people to recently become famous, and because Janko himself has been publicly criticized over the last few months. Now, if you haven't heard, Janko has been called out in a few key YouTube videos for some of his moments on the Impaulsive podcast, such as when he was roasted by comedian Bobby Lee and he walked off the podcast. Another example would be when Shaq would call out Janko for his lack of contribution to the podcast. Now, when Bobby Lee decided to roast Janko, Janko walked off the podcast and he did not return. This led to comedian Bobby Lee saying, quote, "Did I really hurt him? Be honest with me, is he really mad, this guy?" Now, after hearing about how Janko would eventually leave the podcast, it's safe to say that yes, Janko was actually very upset in this moment. However, according to sources, it seems like Janko was more upset with Logan Paul and Mike Malak, his two co-hosts, not Bobby Lee himself. Earlier this year, Janko left the Impaulsive podcast following multiple heated moments between himself, his guests, and co-hosts Logan Paul and Mike Malak. In May, Janko tweeted, quote, "To the Impaulsive fans, I'm so sorry I can't speak about things, not my choice. I do love you guys, and for those of you sending me the clip of them talking trash, it's all love. I've already moved on from that toxic environment." It was clear from this tweet that Janko was likely under some sort of non-disclosure agreement and was unable to discuss the topic in detail. But what do you think of this new Top G podcast? Have you watched the full interview on YouTube? I'm Grady Hooper, and this has been Famous News.